There's a particular kind of silence that fills the room after you say no for the first time. Not the comfortable silence of mutual understanding, not the quiet pause that follows a reasonable conversation between two adults. This silence is different. It's heavy. It carries a charge. And if you've ever experienced it, you probably remember exactly how it felt in your body. The tightening in your chest, the subtle nausea, the almost overwhelming urge to take back what you just said, to soften it, to apologize, to rephrase, to explain yourself 5 different ways until the other person's face relaxes and the tension dissolves and everything goes back to normal. Back to the version of normal where you carry everything quietly and no one has to feel uncomfortable. If that experience sounds familiar, if the act of simply stating what you need or what you will no longer accept fills you not with confidence, but with a kind of dread that seems wildly disproportionate to the situation, then what follows may offer some clarity. Because here's the question that most conversations about boundaries fail to ask. Why does your boundary make certain people so uncomfortable? And perhaps more importantly, why does their discomfort feel so unbearable to you? These two questions are deeply connected, and when explored through the lens of trauma-informed psychology, particularly the work of physician and author Dr. Gabor Maté, they begin to reveal something far more significant than a simple disagreement between two people about what's acceptable and what isn't. They reveal the emotional architecture that was built inside you long before you had any say in its construction. To understand why boundaries create such intense reactions, both in the person setting them and in the person encountering them, it helps to understand what a boundary actually is at the psychological level. Most popular advice frames boundaries as rules, lines in the sand, firm declarations of what you will and will not tolerate. And while that framing isn't entirely wrong, it misses the deeper function of what's actually happening when a person begins to set boundaries for the first time. According to Dr. Gabor Maté, a boundary is fundamentally an expression of selfhood. It is the assertion that you exist as a separate being with your own needs, your own perceptions, your own emotional reality, and that this reality is valid even when it differs from what someone else wants or expects from you. Boundaries, in this sense, aren't walls built to keep people out. They are declarations of existence. They say, I am here, I am real, what I feel matters. And for many people, this declaration, as simple and reasonable as it sounds, feels genuinely dangerous. Not intellectually, not rationally, but in the body, in the nervous system, in the deep, wordless layers of emotional memory that were shaped during the earliest years of life. The question is, why? One of the most important ideas in Gabor Mate's body of work is the distinction between two fundamental needs that every child is born with. The first is the need for attachment, the need to be close to, connected with, and accepted by the people who care for you. The second is the need for authenticity, the need to feel and express your own emotions, to know what you want, to register your own internal signals, and to act in accordance with who you actually are. In an ideal environment, these two needs coexist. A child can be fully themselves and fully loved at the same time. They can cry and still be held. They can say no and still be safe. They can express anger, sadness, fear, need, or disagreement without any threat to the relationship. Attachment and authenticity grow together, reinforcing one another. The child learns implicitly, I can be real and I can be loved. These two things are not in conflict. But for many children, the environment communicates something very different. Maybe the parent was overwhelmed, stressed by financial pressure, marital conflict, their own unresolved trauma, mental health struggles, or simply the crushing weight of circumstances that left them with very little emotional bandwidth. Maybe the parent was loving in many ways, but could not tolerate certain emotions. Maybe sadness made them anxious. Maybe anger frightened them. Maybe the child's needs, expressed openly and naturally, as all children's needs are, triggered something in the parent, some unprocessed wound, some deep sense of inadequacy, and the parent pulled away, grew cold, became irritable, shut down. Or perhaps they didn't do anything overtly harmful at all. Perhaps they simply weren't emotionally present enough for the child to feel fully seen. In any of these scenarios, the child faces an impossible dilemma. Not a conscious one, children don't think in these terms, but an emotional and biological one. The child's nervous system registers. When I express what I truly feel, the connection I depend on for survival becomes less stable. When I am fully myself, the person I need most becomes less available. And so, as Gabor Maté often explains, the child makes an unconscious but profoundly consequential choice. When attachment and authenticity come into conflict, when being real threatens the closeness the child literally cannot survive without, the child will suppress authenticity to preserve attachment. Every time. Because attachment is not optional for a developing human, it is a biological imperative. A child cannot survive alone. And so the child learns in the deepest part of their being that their authentic self, their real feelings, real needs, real impulses is a threat. Not a threat to the world, a threat to love. This is where the story of boundaries actually begins. Not in adulthood, not in the self-help section of a bookstore, not in the moment someone finally says no to a friend or a partner or a parent. It begins in childhood. It begins in the thousands of small, often invisible moments where a developing person learns, without anyone explicitly teaching them, that their needs are an inconvenience, that their feelings make things harder, that the safest version of themselves is the version that takes up the least emotional space. Consider a child who learns early on that expressing sadness is met with impatience. The parent doesn't hit the child, doesn't yell, but when the child cries, the parent sighs, turns away, says something like, "You're fine, stop being dramatic," or simply looks uncomfortable in a way the child can feel but can't articulate. Over time, the child's nervous system encodes a lesson. Sadness is not safe to express. Not because the child reasons this out, but because the body learns through repetition what to suppress in order to maintain proximity to the caregiver. Now expand this pattern across years, across thousands of interactions. The child learns to read the room before expressing anything, learns to monitor the emotional state of others before checking in with their own, learns that the question is never, "What do I feel?" but always, "What does this situation require me to be?" This child, Gabor Maté would point out, isn't developing a personality. They are developing a survival strategy. And that strategy, however effective it may be in childhood, becomes the foundation upon which they build their entire adult identity. Fast forward 20, 30, 40 years, that child is now an adult. And something interesting has happened. The survival strategy that once protected them has become invisible. It doesn't feel like a strategy anymore. It feels like who they are. They describe themselves as easygoing, adaptable, low maintenance, the kind of person who doesn't like to make a fuss. They pride themselves on being helpful, accommodating, emotionally available to others. They're the friend who always listens, the partner who never complains, the employee who never pushes back, the family member who smooths everything over. And from the outside, this person looks fine, functional, often admired. But on the inside, there's an exhaustion that never fully lifts, a subtle resentment that seems to have no clear source, a creeping sense of emptiness that shows up most loudly in quiet moments. And underneath all of it, so deep they may not even recognize it, a grief that has no name. The grief of having never fully been themselves, of having spent a lifetime performing a version of selfhood that was designed not to express who they are, but to manage how others feel. This is the person who, when they finally try to set a boundary, when they finally say, "I can't do that," or "that doesn't work for me," or "I need something different," feels not empowered, but terrified. Because to their nervous system, that boundary is not a healthy act of self respect. It is the repetition of the original threat. It is the moment where authenticity and attachment collide again, and the body remembers with perfect clarity what happened the last time those two things came into conflict. The body remembers you were alone. Now, here's where the conversation deepens, because it's not just the person setting the boundary who has a reaction, it's the person receiving it. And this is what many discussions about boundaries overlook entirely. When you set a boundary with someone, particularly someone who has grown accustomed to a version of you that doesn't have boundaries, you are not just changing a rule, you're changing the relational contract. You're altering the dynamic that both of you often unconsciously have agreed to. And for the other person, this change can feel destabilizing in ways that may seem irrational, but are, from a psychological perspective, entirely predictable. Think about it this way. If someone in your life has always been the accommodating one, the agreeable one, the one who absorbs conflict and never pushes back, and then suddenly that person starts expressing limits, what's actually happening is that the role you've relied on them to play is disappearing. And depending on your own psychological history, this can feel like anything from mild annoyance to genuine emotional threat. Gabor Maté's work emphasizes that relationships are often organized around complementary adaptations. One person overfunctions, the other underfunctions. One person pursues, the other withdraws. One person manages emotions for the entire system, the other is freed from having to manage their own. These dynamics aren't consciously chosen. They are co-created, often by two people whose childhood adaptations happen to interlock in ways that feel comfortable, not because they are healthy, but because they are familiar. When one person in this system begins to change, begins to reclaim their own needs, their own voice, their own emotional reality, the other person doesn't just lose a convenience, they lose a psychological structure they've been leaning on without realizing it. And this is why boundaries don't just create discomfort, they create exposure. They reveal what the other person has been relying on you to carry. And for many people, that revelation is deeply unwelcome. So, what does the discomfort actually reveal? This is perhaps the most important question, and the one that deserves the most honest, most compassionate answer. When someone reacts with anger, guilt tripping, withdrawal, or emotional punishment in response to your boundary, it is tempting to interpret their behavior as proof that they don't care about you. And in some cases, that may be partly true. But from a trauma-informed perspective, the reaction often reveals something more complex. It reveals their own unmet needs, their own unprocessed fear, their own relationship with vulnerability and control and emotional safety. Many people who react badly to boundaries are not consciously trying to manipulate. They are responding from their own survival system. Their nervous system is registering your boundary as a loss of control. And control, for many people who grew up in chaotic or emotionally unpredictable environments, is not about power, it's about safety. When you change, the world becomes less predictable for them. And unpredictability for a nervous system shaped by early instability can feel genuinely threatening. This doesn't mean their reaction is acceptable. It doesn't mean you should abandon your boundary to soothe their fear. But understanding the deeper mechanism can help you hold your position with more clarity and less self-doubt. Because when you understand that their discomfort is about their own emotional history, not about the validity of your need, you stop interpreting their reaction as evidence that you did something wrong. And that shift from guilt to clarity is one of the most important transitions in the entire healing process. There's another layer to this that many people find deeply confronting when they first encounter it. Sometimes the most painful response to your boundary doesn't come from a stranger or a difficult colleague. It comes from someone you love, a parent, a sibling, a partner, a close friend, someone whose love you do not doubt and whose reaction to your boundary still makes you feel, in some quiet and devastating way, that you are being selfish for having needs at all. This is the situation that breaks people open. Because the popular narrative about boundaries tends to divide the world into two categories: healthy people who respect your boundaries and toxic people who don't. And while that framework can be useful in extreme cases, in situations involving abuse, coercion, or deliberate control, it fails to capture the reality that most people encounter, which is far more nuanced and far more painful. The reality is that many of the people who struggle with your boundaries are not bad people. They are wounded people. They are people who, in their own way, are also operating from survival patterns they never chose. And the dynamic between you, the one where you give endlessly and they receive without questioning it, may have felt to both of you like closeness, like intimacy, like love. Gabor Mate's framework helps illuminate why this particular confusion is so common. When a child learns that love is conditional, that closeness depends on suppressing their own needs, they develop a template for what love looks like. And that template doesn't disappear in adulthood. It becomes the filter through which all relationships are interpreted. So when someone requires your self suppression in order to feel comfortable with you, it doesn't register as a problem. It registers as normal. It feels like home. It feels like love. Because in the original home, that's exactly what love required. Recognizing this pattern is not about blaming parents or condemning loved ones. It is about seeing clearly. Seeing that what felt like love may have also been a dynamic. That closeness and self erasure are not the same thing. That you can love someone deeply and still recognize that the terms of the relationship, the unspoken contract that requires you to abandon yourself in order to maintain connection, are not sustainable. And more importantly, that changing those terms is not a betrayal, it is a return. A return to what exactly? This is where the conversation shifts from problem to possibility. And it's important to approach this shift honestly, without overpromising, without romantic language about transformation, without suggesting that healing is a single event that resolves everything. What Gabor Mate's work consistently points toward is not a destination but a process. The process of reconnecting with the authentic self that was suppressed in the service of survival. Not because the authentic self is some perfect, idealized version of you that's been hiding beneath the surface, waiting to emerge in a moment of dramatic revelation, but because authenticity, the capacity to know what you feel, to trust your own perceptions, to express your needs without performing them, to exist in relationship without disappearing, is a fundamental human need. And when that need has been suppressed for decades, its recovery doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small, often uncomfortable moments of practice. It happens the first time you say no without offering an explanation. It happens the first time you sit with someone's disappointment without rushing to fix it. It happens the first time you notice the urge to apologize for resisting and choose not to act on it. It happens the first time you feel the full weight of someone's displeasure and discover, perhaps with some surprise, that you can survive it. That the catastrophe your nervous system predicted was the loss of love, the abandonment, the unbearable aloneness, doesn't actually materialize. Or if it does, in some diminished form, you discover that you can bear it. That you are no longer a child whose survival depends on someone else's approval. That the danger your body remembers is real, but it is historical. It belongs to a time when you truly couldn't afford to be yourself. That time is over, even if your body hasn't fully gotten a message yet. There's a concept in psychology that's worth exploring here, one that Gabor Maté touches on frequently in his discussions of healing, and that resonates deeply with anyone who has ever tried to change a lifelong pattern. The concept is this: the things that are hardest to change are usually the things that were most necessary to develop. Your people-pleasing isn't a flaw, it was a brilliant adaptation. Your hypervigilance to other people's emotions isn't a weakness, it was a finely tuned survival skill. Your inability to say no wasn't cowardice, it was the most intelligent response available to a child who needed to maintain a bond with an emotionally limited caregiver. This reframing matters enormously, because one of the greatest obstacles to healing is the shame people feel about their own patterns. They look at their behavior, the constant apologizing, the self abandonment, the inability to tolerate someone else's discomfort, and they judge themselves. They think, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just be normal? Why is this so hard? And shame, as any trauma informed clinician will attest, is not a catalyst for change. It is a barrier to it. Shame tells you that you are the problem, that there's something fundamentally defective about you. And as long as you believe that, you will keep trying to fix yourself through the same mechanisms that created the problem in the first place. More accommodation, more self suppression, more contortion of your own reality to fit someone else's expectations. Gabor Maté's approach offers a different path, not fixing, but understanding, not eradicating the pattern, but recognizing its origin, not forcing yourself to be different, but creating enough safety, internal safety, the kind that comes from self-compassion rather than self-criticism, to allow something different to emerge. This is not a passive process. It requires courage, real courage, the kind that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, no grand gestures, no public declarations, but that feels on the inside like the bravest thing you've ever done. Because saying, this is what I need, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, to a parent, a partner, a friend, a colleague, anyone whose emotional reaction you spent your whole life trying to manage, is an act of profound vulnerability. And vulnerability, contrary to what many people were taught, is not weakness. It is the precondition for genuine connection. Let's come back to the original question. Why does your boundary make them uncomfortable? By now, the answer is layered. It makes them uncomfortable because it changes the dynamic they've grown accustomed to, because it confronts them with needs they may not have been meeting, because it disrupts a system that was functioning, not healthily, but predictably. Because your boundary, in its quiet and firm way, says, I am no longer available to be the person who holds everything together at the expense of myself. And that statement, however gently delivered, sends a ripple through every relationship that was built on the assumption that you would always put yourself last. Some people will adjust. They will feel the discomfort, sit with it, perhaps even grow from it. They will learn to relate to you in a new way, a way that makes room for both of you to be real. And some people won't, not because they are villains, but because the version of you that had no boundaries served a function in their emotional economy. And losing that function feels to them like losing something essential. What they may not realize, what they may never realize, is that what they're losing isn't you, it's their access to your self-abandonment. And those are very different things. Knowing the difference, really knowing it, not just intellectually, but in your bones, is one of the most important milestones in the entire journey toward wholeness. There's one more thing that deserves attention before this conversation comes to a close. And it has to do with what happens after you set the boundary, after the initial discomfort, after the reaction, after the silence. Many people expect that setting a boundary will feel like liberation, and sometimes it does, eventually. But in the immediate aftermath, what many people feel is grief, a deep, quiet, sometimes bewildering grief. Not grief for the relationship necessarily, though that can be part of it, but grief for the years they spent without this awareness. Grief for the child who learned to disappear in order to be loved. Grief for all the moments they said yes when they meant no. All the times they swallowed their own reality to keep the peace. All the energy they spent monitoring other people's emotions while their own went unacknowledged. This grief is not a sign that something went wrong. It is a sign that something is finally being felt. Something that has been waiting patiently beneath decades of accommodation for permission to surface. And the willingness to feel it, to let it move through you without fixing it, without explaining it away, without immediately redirecting your attention to someone else's needs, is itself an act of healing. Not a cure, not a resolution, but a beginning. The beginning of a different kind of relationship with yourself. One where you are not the caretaker of everyone else's emotional comfort. One where your own inner experience is allowed to matter. One where the question, what do I need, is not selfish but necessary. Dr. Gabor Mate's work consistently returns to a central insight that is both simple and radical. That healing is not about becoming someone new. It is about recovering the connection to who you were before the world required you to be someone else. Before you learned that love had conditions. Before you learned that your worth was determined by your usefulness. Before you learned that the safest place in a room was the place where you were invisible. That version of you, the one who could feel without apology, who could need without shame, who could exist without performing, didn't disappear. It was buried under years of adaptation, under layers of protective strategy, under the quiet, relentless effort of being the person everyone else needed you to be. And the process of uncovering that self, through awareness, through therapy, through honest relationship, through the slow and sometimes painful practice of telling the truth, is not linear, it is not fast, it is not always dramatic, but it is, in the deepest sense of the word, the most important work a person can do. Not because it guarantees a perfect life, but because it offers something that no amount of accommodation ever could: the chance to be real, the chance to be known, the chance to discover that love, real love, the kind that doesn't require you to vanish in order to receive it, is possible, not in the abstract, not as a theory, but as a lived experience, available not only to other people, but to you. Healing rarely happens all at once. It happens in the accumulation of small choices, each one a tiny act of faith that your own reality deserves to take up space in the world. Some days those choices will feel empowering. Some days they will feel excruciating. And some days they will simply feel like what they are: the quiet, unglamorous, profoundly meaningful work of becoming yourself. As Gabor Mate's body of work reminds us again and again, with patience, with rigor, and with an extraordinary depth of compassion, understanding where our patterns come from doesn't erase the past, but it can transform our relationship to it. And that transformation, however gradual, is the ground on which a different kind of life becomes possible. Not a perfect life, but an honest one. And perhaps in the end, that's enough to begin. If any part of this discussion resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which idea stood out to you the most? What landed differently than you expected? And if you value thoughtful conversations about psychology, emotional healing, and the patterns that shape our lives, consider subscribing. There's much more ahead, and every conversation like this one is built on the belief that understanding ourselves more deeply is always worth the effort.